In 1955, when I was 15 years old, I moved with my grandmother and her sister, who had brought me up from my being a baby, to Queanbeyan near Canberra, so that I could go to a boarding school near to home. I'd been ill over the 18 months before we moved, recovering from tuberculosis, and while living previously in the isolated small New Zealand town we'd been resident in since I was 5, all the schools available to me had been at great distances from our home, which, in view of a risk that I might suddenly become perilously ill while boarding, as I was still not totally over my pulmonary weakness, my grandmother didn't want. So she decided to return with me to Queanbeyan, which had been my late grandfather's hometown and was where she'd brought up my late father, so I could board at an excellent school there. One of her friends actually taught at that school, and in fact, she actually had taught at it herself for a couple years after her husband's death. She didn't want me to be learning alone at home with a governess, with my Canterbury friends all at schools far away. I didn't either. I was happy about the move. My grandmother rented a comfortable and pleasant new build house in a bush plot. It was close to lots of beautiful native scrubland where she, my great aunt, and I before long frequently went hiking. This house didn't seem remarkable to us in any way. It was just a nice, average house with spacious rooms and, for me, a lovely bedroom. We arrived in the summer, with me being very excited at the prospect of boarding school. After 3 weeks, I started my first term. I was very happy at school, apart from one thing. From my first days there, I kept on having realistic, terrifying nightmares. In my first ones, I'd see my grandmother sitting in the evening below a lamp in our new home, working on her needlepoint or her crochet, and in the corner of the room behind her, staring at her, there'd be an approximately 3-foot, all-gray, fuzzy figure dressed in a cowled, hooded robe. His face, I felt it was male, was never clear, but still managed to look very strange and malevolent. In other dreams, I'd actually be at home watching my grandmother or my great aunt occupied with various normal household activities, and I'd see a short, evil-looking figure which I could only describe as a sort of pixie wandering around our house unseen by them. This would do things like pick out scissors or pins from my grandmother's needlework box with an evil cackle, or cut at an electricity cable near my great-aunt's footstool with a small saw. In the worst one, I saw, as if actually present in her kitchen, my grandmother with her back to me at the kitchen sink, washing up the breakfast things, while, just in front of me, this pixie figure held a very sharp Stanley knife and was waving it about while pointing it at her. In the dream, I found I couldn't speak out to warn my grandmother. I somehow knew that I wasn't in danger myself, as I had some awareness that in reality I was asleep in bed at school. Which makes no sense, of course, but that's what I experienced. Feeling frozen, unable to call out or do anything, I eventually woke up, drenched in a cold sweat. I never told anyone at school about my nightmares. I didn't want anyone to think I was weak or seeking attention. I didn't tell my grandmother or my great aunt, who were both very caring, the content of my dreams. On my weekend trips home in my first term and during half-term breaks after I became a full-time boarder and in the content of their letters, my grandmother and great aunt seemed to have no problems. My grandmother had renewed the ties with locally living friends and in-law relations she'd associated with when she previously lived in Queanbeyan, and she seemed happily involved in the town's social scene. She was a lady who had always been able to find plenty to interest her and occupy her wherever she lived, and her sister also had those traits. There seemed nothing at home to disturb me. Until I went home for the winter holidays. When I stepped through the front door of our home, I suddenly had this weird feeling overcome me. I don't quite know how to describe it, but the place felt different to how it previously had and sort of charged. Like there was a sort of wildness to the atmosphere and a tinkle of static to the air. I walked into the sitting room and saw, besides the neat pleated long brown drapes over the French doors, a small pine tree decorated for Christmas. Now, bear in mind that this was in July because we were in the southern hemisphere winter. It was cold and frosty, as it was or is in Aqueon Bay in winter, but of course not Christmas time. Nevertheless, there the tree was, sparkling with fairy lights and strands of silver tinsel, with my grandmother's treasured antique angel on the top. I saw that she'd also decorated it with cut-out silver card fairies, and near to the bottom there was a hand-knitted something which resembled a gnome or gonk. It had a brightly multicolored hat and a chocolate-brown face with a bright orange little pom-pom nose. So it looked attractively cheerful. But there was just something about its face, which was like the pixie figure I used to see in my nightmares. My grandmother had always loved Christmas. She'd always missed, too, the Northern Hemisphere Christmases of her youth in Switzerland and for a couple of years in London where she'd met my grandfather. She'd actually put up a little twinkling tree in the winter once or twice when we lived on the Canterbury Plains in New Zealand. At home and in England, on the days when it was dismal and dreary and cold, at least we had all the glittering lights from the trees and the stores and the lovely decorations to cheer me up, she said, as she'd said before. The dark cold lately was making me feel a bit down, so I got a tree cut this week, they have beautiful pine trees here, and put my lights and some ornaments on it. It might be an odd thing to do, but it's harmless. But why that gnome, though? I asked. Now that was odd, because although in recent years gnomes and gonks have become popular Christmas ornaments outside of Scandinavia, where they're traditional to Christmas, that definitely wasn't the case in Australia and New Zealand in the 1950s, or in the England and Switzerland, which as a family we'd immigrated from, at least to my knowledge. Well, I just felt like knitting that somehow, my grandmother said. The idea for it popped into my head, and I like it. I agreed truthfully that it did look good, but as I sat down nearby, there seemed to be an intensity of the perturbing, tingly feels around it. The next day, one of my late father's first cousins visited us with her daughter, who was around my age. Father's cousin and her husband were going on a short excursion for a few days and had arranged to leave Helen, not her real name, with us for that time. I developed a friendship with Helen during the days that I was home from school. We got on very well. That evening, we were in my bedroom, chatting and listening to gramophone records, when in the middle of talking, my cousin suddenly paused and went quite pale. "You don't have a dog, do you?" she said. I replied that we didn't, and she looked like she'd seen a ghost. "Oh, it's just that I thought I saw something moving past the doorway, out of the corner of my eye, like a dog's height, small, dark figure. I guess it was a trick of the light." I hadn't told Helen about any of my nightmares. Soon afterwards, I glimpsed something like that too. Something moving too quickly to really see it, especially as it seemed to be all black, like a shadow. So did my cousin. We both did, many times over the 4 days she stayed. We became used to seeing something short, dark, and flitting. We were spooked, but not terrified or obsessed with it. I didn't reveal what I feared the glimpses were of. But much worse was yet to come. Even today, I cannot explain what happened. On Helen's last night with us, I was fast asleep in my bedroom, with Helen sleeping in another bed besides mine. Out of a sound sleep, I awoke quite suddenly, a feeling of menace and the air being charged rousing me. I opened my eyes and, floating in front of me in the darkness, apparently supported by nothing and no one, was the winter tree's gnome. And in that darkness, it glowed, and its face looked as if it was evilly laughing. I screamed and screamed. My grandmother and great-aunt rushed in, finding me hysterical, and on my coverlid that was over my quilts was the tree gnome. How could it have gotten there? Helen told us that when my screams had woken her, she'd seen the evil gnome floating over my bed, and that she'd seen in the space beyond the doorway in front of my bed, past the half-open door, just before the adults arrived, an evil-looking little man, a malicious, expressioned pixie, staring at me. A month or so after this, my grandmother bought a house nearby for us to live in, and while I was at school, we left the old one. We were very happy in our new house. For all the New Years, we were resident there, and at school, all of my nightmares stopped. But from that day to this, I've always wondered what could explain these frightening, uncanny happenings, and I have quite a fear of gnome toys and gonks at Christmas. Or any time, really.
Thank you for watching this video. Big shout out to my patrons, Leaf Ninja, Roy Larimer, Mr. Creepypasta, Nicole Kister, Neon Scoundrel, William Delphin, and So Much Heresy. If you want to become a patron, buy merch, or join my Discord server, be sure to check out the links in the description. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.